What will the committee decide, and what reasons will the committee give to its reasons here in the third edition of the College Football Playoff Rankings? Welcome into the voice of college football and our weekly tradition during the season. Once the College Football Playoff Rankings come out, that's to get together for the big watch party, which we are in the middle of right now as we look at the latest on the unveilings on another Tuesday night. Welcome in. Please hit the like button before you settle in. And of course, the call-in line has been placed there in the chat. So please give me a call right here at the Voice of College Football, and we will break it down as we get the unveilings here soon. Of course, some of the highlights around college football going into this third week of rankings over the weekend. Colorado won. They beat Utah by about 4 touchdowns. And of course, the Buffs control the Big 12. We've got a huge game with Arizona State taking on a BYU team that has now lost a game, and now their future is uncertain. We've got Miami and SMU on a collision course to the ACC championship game. If they can stave off any upset possibilities the last 2 weekends of the season, we've got that collection of teams in the SEC that are gunning for a 10-2 records minimum that you would think for any of them would land them in the college football playoffs. Had you said any of the names of Texas, Texas A&M, Tennessee, and on down the line before the season started and placed a 10-win season next to that team, you would have guaranteed, or so we thought, that team would have made the playoffs. But with so few spots, and one going to the group of 5, and Notre Dame in line with only 1 loss, maybe somebody completes a nice 10-2 season with a difficult schedule in the SEC and still gets left out. And what about the case of Indiana? No losses on their record right now, but a weak schedule. They have yet to be challenged, at least by a good team. They lack a formidable win. They have got one winning record team in the W column. That's Washington at a mere 6-5. And of course, they've got the showdown against Ohio State. Oregon's the number 1 team in the country. They narrowly escaped in Camp Randall Stadium against Wisconsin, and Oregon should maintain their number 1 status. But how far does BYU fall? How far does Colorado ascend? Let's check out where we stand right now. We check in at number 25 with Illinois at 7-3. The Illini had the week off, but they moved their way into the college football playoff rankings. They're also in my top 25, by the way. That actually makes sense. UNLV took Syracuse to overtime. They've got a couple of power conference wins over Houston and Kansas, and UNLV at 8-2 now stand at number 24. Mizzou, tough loss over the weekend. Lost in the final 15 seconds of the game at South Carolina. Otherwise, we would be talking about Mizzou, but they're also ran at this point at 7-3. Iowa State picked up a critical win for them to keep their hopes alive of playing in the Big 12 championship game. They defeated Cincinnati 34-17, and we see the Cyclones last weekend were not rated. They moved into the rankings at 8-2. Another unranked team that is finally getting some love, finally getting some respect and recognition, notched their biggest win of the season by far, knocking off Kansas State, and that is Arizona State. What a ride by Kenny Dillingham, Sam Levitt at quarterback, Bo Scatabo at running back, and Jordan Tyson at 13 catches against Kansas State as they marched into Manhattan and took a 21-0 lead. And Arizona State suddenly is on the radar, and they've got a date against BYU coming up this Saturday. Now we are at number 20 with another group of 5 entry in Tulane, 9-2. And of course, Tulane has been one of the better group of 5 programs in recent years. Won a Cotton Bowl a couple years ago against USC. Almost made it to what would have been a college football playoff in a 12-team format last year. Okay, team of the week, Army. Number 19, and a date with Notre Dame, of course. The entire season rides on Army. they could upend this entire deal if they continue to win and pull off the major upset this weekend. South Carolina at number 18. If there's a 3-loss team that's going to make the playoffs, and I don't believe that's going to happen, but South Carolina at 7-3, number 18. Clemson, of course, those two teams play in a couple weekends on rivalry weekend. Clemson at 17. They move up 3 spots. Colorado moves up 1 spot from number 16. And they are an 8-2 football team. Colorado disposed of Utah, scoring 49 points against a really good Utah defense. And the Buffs with the star power of Deion Sanders, Travis Hunter, who might win the Heisman Trophy, and Shedeur Sanders. At number 15, we've got Texas A&M. And only one of those 2 losses that you see right there is in conference play. So Texas A&M controls its destiny to get all the way to the SEC championship game. BYU, the big fall, the big drop, the big plummet, down 8 spots, as they should be. They fall to a 3-6 Kansas team at home, no less. BYU is now 9-1 after the loss, and they are on the outside looking in. And obviously, with the lack of opportunities going forward, even though they play a decent Arizona State team this weekend, BYU's got to win the conference championship to climb all the way from 14 up high enough. There would have to be all sorts of chaos for BYU to lose another game and still make the playoff. It looks like a one-bid situation for both the ACC and the Big 12, most likely. Number 13 is SMU, now 9-1. SMU held off Boston College over the weekend, and the Mustangs, sitting pretty at 9-1, moved up a spot. They are still on the outside looking in, but it's all about winning the ACC championship for SMU. Now we get into the top 12, and as long as there is a group of 5 within the top 12, which of course there will be with Boise State, and there they are, then these would be, as of today, the 12 teams to make the college football playoff. Boise State, 9-1. Broncos, they defeated San Jose State by 3 touchdowns this past weekend. They move up a spot. And again, they're in line in the group of 5. Now, if Boise State continues to win and we get an Army upset against Notre Dame, then we've got much controversy to deal with in the group of 5. Tennessee drops 4 spots. They were outclassed by Georgia easily in that game. It was a good ball game for 3 quarters, and then Georgia pulled away, and now they have eclipsed Tennessee, of course, with the head-to-head win. The Bulldogs are 8-2. They rise to number 10 in the country, and Georgia's got one of those SEC November scrimmages against UMass before they take on Georgia Tech. Of course, it was just a week ago that Ole Miss took care of Georgia at home 28-10. The Rebels now at 8-2, number 9 in the country. Let's look at the top 8. I'm feeling a Notre Dame. No, we've got a Miami coming up. The Hurricanes had the week off. They finished with Wake and Syracuse on the road, and then the ACC championship game if they get there. If they don't, of course, they're finished. They have to get to the title game and most likely win it. Alabama's at number 7. They moved up 3 spots after they defeated Mercer. The Tide is 8-2, number 6 in the country. And apparently receiving some love this week would be, yes, Notre Dame moved up a couple spots. Now, Notre Dame is now 9-1. And Notre Dame coming off a win against Virginia rather easily in that one, 35-14. We've made our way to the top 5 in all of college football. In Indiana, I think they've held serve. They were at number 5 last week. The Hoosiers had a bye week, and it's all about Ohio State on the road. In Indiana, most people are thinking have to play well, not necessarily win, play well to get to the playoffs. We had a conversation today with Steve Dace from Michigan Podcast, so be looking out for that to be released in the morning at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. The premiere was Steve Dace, my discussion with Steve about the college football playoff rankings and more, to be released right here on the main channel, 10 a.m. Eastern Time. We talked about Indiana and Steve's thoughts about the Hoosiers and Kurt Cignetti's team's resume. 4, 3, 2, and 1 in some order. Looks like Penn State at number 4. Nittany Lions at 9 and 1. Texas at number 3. They're 9 and 1. No movement between those teams from last week to this week. Penn State beat Washington over the weekend. No, that was 2 weekends ago. Let's see. Penn State's latest win, yes, against Washington. Texas now 9 and 1. There we skip the rest of the top 5, which is held firm from 5 to 1. Indiana, Penn State, Texas, Ohio State at number 2 at 9 and 1. Oregon is 11 and 0. Now we take your calls. Appreciate you being here at the Voice of College Football, and we will take those in order. We got our buddy Michael on the line. Michael, what's going on?
Hey, Mark, good evening. How you doing, sir?
I am doing just fine. What's going on with you?
Not much. Was you kind of surprised BYU fell that far?
No, they lost a game to a 3-6 Kansas team. They lost at home. They also had some close calls before that obviously factored into the ranking before this particular ranking. But we also have to look at what teams have done on a particular team's schedule going backward. So it's not just an evaluation of what did this team do this weekend. It's about what does their schedule look like and what happened. So, for example, Louisville lost to Stanford this weekend. Louisville's not even in the rankings. Well, they were last weekend,
Yep.
And they had a nice, solid resume with only 1-score losses against Notre Dame, Miami, and SMU. But now Louisville loses a horrible game against Stanford, and that draws back all the resumes of Notre Dame, SMU, and Miami. To what extent the committee looks at that, but they have told us that they do look at that, much like I do as well.
Mm-hmm. My thing I'm trying to figure out is what happened with SMU when they ranked. Was it that bad loss or somehow? Because I'm trying to figure out how they're the outside looking in right now.
Well, there's also a eyeball factor in this, and I think that's hurting SMU. Why it's hurting them, I don't know, because I think they've played really good football. Now, their loss, of course, going all the way back to September against BYU, took a hit with BYU losing, so that's not as superlative of a loss.
Mm-hmm.
So they took that hit. I'm trying to think who else would. Well, I just noted the Louisville game, so that's not as good a win. They had a ranked win out of Louisville just a week ago, and now they don't any longer.
Okay. The other thing I'm trying to figure out is what is it going to take for? Does Arizona State still need help to play in the Big 12 championship, or you think it's pretty much going to be BYU and Colorado?
Arizona State plays BYU this weekend.
Oh.
So if Arizona State wins that game, they will tie BYU with 2 losses in the conference and obviously have the head-to-head. So they will get to the Big 12 championship game by beating Arizona.
Okay. And how good of a game do you think that could be if it is Colorado State and Arizona? I mean, Colorado to Arizona State.
Yeah, I really have not seen a whole lot of Arizona State this year, but I got to commend them for what they've accomplished. Most of their games have been rather close. What they did this past weekend has to be their best win to go to Kansas State and go up 21-0. There were, if you really look at that game, and I skimmed through it and I read the box score and I read the recap, and I did not watch the game, but I went through the game highlights and so forth. There were a lot of gifts in that game from Kansas State, a lot of things that really led to that Arizona State lead. But they're a pretty good football team. And again, Kenny Dillingham's doing a heck of a job, but I would really favor Colorado in that game. I just think they have such an advantage at a few different key spots with the kind of NFL talent they have.
Okay. Basically, this is like the varsity playing the JV week in the SEC. So do you think all hell breaks loose next Saturday, Thanksgiving weekend?
Well, let's stop here for a second. Who do we have in the SEC that matters? We've got a couple games showing up. We got Ole Miss. Listen to this. Ole Miss goes to Florida. Now, they should take care of business, but that's not a gimme. Florida's coming off a nice game. There's somebody else out there. Who else in the SEC's playing that matters? Texas A&M goes to Auburn. Auburn's played like crap this year. Auburn has really underachieved. They've been disappointing, but at Auburn at night, that could be a little bit tricky too.
Okay. Speaking of Auburn, is the game next week at Bryant-Denny or is it down at Jordan-Hare?
Let me get my years straight. They go every other. So
I'm thinking Bryant-Denny, but I'm not 100%.
Yeah, they're at Bryant-Denny Stadium because Auburn gave them a great game. Well, yeah. Last year was the Jalen Milroe 4th and 32 play. That was at Jordan-Hare. Yeah, so they're back in Tuscaloosa.
All right. Last thing before I let you go, because I know you got a gazillion callers. What's the worst IU can lose by and still be all right? If it's within 10 to 14 points, are they safe, you think?
Well, I know you got to frame it in terms of a point total and a point spread, and I get that, Michael. I hope the committee's smarter than that. I hope they're really watching the football. You know as well as I do, watching as much football as you do, that it could be a great game. It could be a 3 or 1 score game, let's say, and we're going into the final 10 minutes of play, and then Ohio State scores a couple touchdowns and wins by 21 when it was really well played for the first 50 minutes. Or it could be Ohio State races out 21-0 and then coasts from there. So I hope they're not just looking at, but I get your point. I get where you're going. I think that if they play within 2 scores, I think that if Ohio State, then it's going to somewhat matter that Ohio State completes the season against Michigan, goes to the Big Ten championship game, and at least doesn't get blown out. And whether they win or lose, I think that that's going to solidify Indiana's spot.
Okay. Last thing before I let you go. You've done these a few years in the past, but is there a chance you might live stream a game? Like you've done in the past?
Oh, do some watch parties?
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess we'll think about that. I guess if I could take some kind of poll and get a positive reaction of people wanting us to do that. For what games do you want that?
I would think the first one would be Saturday at noon.
Oh, Ohio State, Indiana.
Yeah.
I got you. Yeah, so I just try to watch multiple games, though, is my approach to all this. But I appreciate the suggestion.
Yeah. All right. Mark, thanks for and I know I said I was going to DM me about the book, but I haven't got a chance to because I've been a little bit battling allergies and stuff like that, but I will do that here for you. Thanks for taking my call, man. Appreciate it.
I appreciate you, Michael. Thanks for calling.
Thank you, man. See you.
We will get another link here in the chat. Give me just 2 seconds and we'll take your call. So once again, the link, I guess the only place the link is at the beginning of the live stream. So that's my issue. I should get that placed in the video description and on X, but there it is. We got Will and D checking in to talk college football playoff rankings. Will, what's going on?
2 more games, Mark. 2 more games.
Okay, I got nothing out of that.
Can you hear me, Mark?
We're starting to hear you a little bit better.
All right, I know. I always have my headset mixed up sometimes. But 2 more games, Mark. 2 more games.
Yeah, you're knocking on the door.
I'm confident. Like, obviously, I have a ton of respect for the student athletes of the Army Academy and everything they do. I just feel like with how good the Notre Dame defense is playing, they shouldn't have much trouble with the Black Knights. I could eat my words, but just the level that this defense is playing, I'm feeling pretty confident.
Well, I was looking at it last week, and I'm going to have to update the stats, but I was thinking, okay, let's make a comparison between Army and Navy because of the styles of play and all the obvious things. And statistically, Army is so much better than Navy. Obviously, Notre Dame crushed Navy. Navy didn't play a good game, but
they shot themselves in the foot over and over again.
Yeah, it was a combination that even if they didn't shoot themselves in the foot, they're not anywhere close to Notre Dame. But they did shoot. They did not play a good game. But Army's been a much tighter team. been more dominant, but Navy plays a tougher schedule. So it's difficult
Mhm.
to evaluate. But if you really go through the stats, Army should be a better team.
Mhm.
I think that's reflected in the point spread too. It's what, about 15?
14 and a half.
Okay, so it's not necessarily a joke of a point spread. I think the Navy
Mhm.
game was north of 20.
Mhm.
So, yeah, I will be surprised if it's a close game, but I don't think it's going to be a joke of a game.
Mhm. Yeah. And Mark, who do you think uh do you think that the Big 12 champion will be better than Boise State, do you think? I'm just curious on what your opinion is. Do you think that Colorado, I guess you would have Colorado.
I do think Colorado is going to win the Big 12.
Mhm.
And I do think that they're going to win their last two games against Kansas and Oklahoma State, win the Big 12 championship. So that's going to put them at 11-2. I think the committee has to keep them ranked above Boise State. Well, they're not ranked above them now, but
Mhm.
as soon as you tack on those 3 wins versus what Boise State's going to do in the final 3 games, I just think that you've got to honor the more difficult schedule. Even though Boise State's got that impressive performance against Oregon, and that's a heck of a performance, I think that Colorado is going to surpass them. Yeah.
Mhm. And I'm just gonna go against Drill MVP's anti Notre Dame rhetoric that he said. I don't know if it was Saturday night. I think it was Saturday night where he was saying that every time Notre Dame's in the playoff, they get blown out. Well, you got to look at the teams that Notre Dame was playing against the playoff, like 2018 Clemson and 2020 Alabama. Like almost like if you look at their championship game, those weren't close either. So
No.
like, and you look at Notre Dame against like the not Nick Saban, God tier, Dabo level teams.
Yeah,
And I
those
think,
were great teams. And the 2012 BCS championship
yeah.
team from Bama.
Mm-hmm.
True
So
enough.
like, yeah, I mean,
You're
I know
sticking
it's
up for your guy
they
BK.
were. I mean, yes, they were pathetic performances, and I feel like BK could have had them more ready. But especially 2012, especially 2012, like that game should not have been like 3 scores. That game should have been 3 to 4 scores. It shouldn't have been just that dominant.
Yeah, that was a demolition. And I still remember
Yeah.
what Brian Kelly looked like at halftime. He just looked like he was shell shocked, like he just did not see it coming and it was just
And the
stunned.
biscuit, that's just that's just not true. Like even if Notre Dame were to lose the game, like it would not be smoked by these 2 lost SEC teams. Like if they lose, I would be shocked if Notre Dame loses by more than 2 scores to any of those SEC teams.
Oh, I think they would play with any of them. We saw one game against Texas A&M,
Yeah.
of course, and that was on the road. And that was when
Mm-hmm.
they were, well, we could talk about both sides maturing and getting better, but Notre Dame had an extremely young offensive line take the field that night. And Riley Leonard, obviously, that's his first game at quarterback, working with the bullets firing, with those wide receivers and with the offensive line. So that's the one sample we've got right now. And
Notre
Texas
Dame
A&M,
also won the line of scrimmage in that game. Like
absolutely.
like both defensive lines won, but Notre Dame's offensive line did enough at the end of the game to win. And I feel like that wouldn't change. Even though both teams have improved, I don't think that would change because Notre Dame's offensive line has gotten better. Notre Dame's defensive line has been great.
Yeah, I'm
Like,
not sold on.
I do think that Notre Dame would win that game 8 times out of 10 against A&M. Maybe not 8 out of 10. That's being a bit of a homer, but at least 6. At least 6.
Yeah, I'll give you that, especially since it was on the road.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a really close game, really much of a rock fight kind of game. But the final 6 or 7 minutes just completely belonged to Notre Dame. So when the game was on the line, they took charge and they really hammered them up front. And that's the only game we've got with Notre Dame in the SEC this year. And Texas A&M is obviously one of the best teams in the SEC. Now, whether they're the best team in the SEC or they're the seventh best team in the SEC, that line's about this big. So even Georgia's been susceptible. Texas, everybody has looked bad at times. It's unless somebody really separates himself throughout the rest of the season, the championship game and the conference, and then into the playoffs. Like, let's say Georgia caught its stride last week and becomes the Georgia of the consensus preseason number one. We may look back and think, oh, yeah, it wasn't the greatest season for Georgia, but then they found their stride. They got that kind of talent. But I really think these teams mostly at this point in the season have shown us what they are, and it's going to be about matchups, and it's going to be about who's just got it that week. And I think Texas A&M might be slightly below those other teams. They don't have the explosiveness on offense that those other teams have, but I think they're all capable, as they've shown, of beating each other. That's for sure.
And last question, Mark. I think that Ohio State wins against Indiana. I mean, I'm not going to say handily, but I mean, the lines of scrimmage, like Indiana lost the lines of scrimmage against Michigan, I felt like. And I feel like Ohio State is going to win that more than by a wider margin than Michigan. And I feel like it'll be a Buckeye easy win.
Well, I'm going to piggyback off of your selection and give everybody a free pick here. Ohio State 38, Indiana 17.
That's pretty similar to what I was going to say. I guess I'll go 42-17. I mean, I hope for Jeffrey, I know, is so excited about Indiana, but like,
we could be here, 4 nights from now?
We could, yeah.
Indiana could have pulled off the upset, the shocker, and they're headed to the Big Ten championship game. And Ohio State's then that puts Ohio State in a precarious situation because their 10-2 would not stack up.
They would at least have that Penn State win. But
you got the Penn State win. They technically have a better loss than anybody in the country.
But what do you think that if it goes the way that we think it will go, do you think that Indiana will be in the top 12?
If they're 11-1, I just think that I would normally think that if we took all these SEC teams, and if you told me, okay, these are the SEC standings, Mark, with 2 games left, knowing that most of them are taking the week off this week, but still, most of them have 1 legitimate game left, that I would be able to forecast some upsets and some of that to tear apart and for that to be a smaller list of teams at 10-2, but I just really don't see it.
Yeah.
I mentioned, I don't know if you heard Texas A&M going to Auburn. If we're really looking for upsets, that's a possibility. Auburn's played like garbage all year, but athletically, in terms of talent, they're roughly as good as Texas A&M, and they're going to be at home at night. That's a possibility. We saw Texas A&M go to South Carolina a couple weeks ago and get whacked in the second half.
Lamar Sellers, best quarterback in the SEC. Did not see that coming.
Is he the best quarterback in the SEC?
In my opinion.
Okay. He's in the top 2. Yeah, I'll go with that.
All right, Mark. Well,
I'll go top 3.
Okay, top 3.
I got to throw Jackson Dart in there and Jalen Milroe.
I just feel like Milroe just. I mean, Dart. You could say Dart. It's a fair point to say Dart, but I don't know. Milroe just he's a little inconsistent for me. But I think his best is probably better than any quarterback in the SEC's best.
I would agree. Will, we appreciate you being here.
Thank you, Mark. I appreciate it.
Always good to see you. Thank you. Our guy Will, hyped about Notre Dame. 9-1. They've got Army. They've got USC at the Coliseum. They've got Army at Yankee Stadium, of course. And one note before we get to our next caller would be that there are scenarios floating out there that if Boise State completes their run, 12-1, Mountain West Conference champions, of course, the one lost to Oregon on the last play of the game. They're already at number 12 in the country. Army, where were they placed? Was it 20? Regardless of where they're placed, that's almost insignificant at this point because they're going to plummet if they lose this weekend. Well, they shouldn't plummet if they lose the 3-point game to Notre Dame, but they're going to be out of it when it comes to a college football playoff. But Army beats Notre Dame. They complete the season with, think about this, 2 nice wins against Navy. That's what, a 7-2 football team right now, 8-2. Then Army completes the American Conference Championship undefeated. And what about a Big 12 champion that has 2 losses? What about a Big 12 champion that has 3 losses? So any of these teams playing this weekend, especially Arizona State and or Colorado could still lose a game, get to the Big 12 championship game, win, be 10-3, match that up against a undefeated Army team as a conference champion and 12-1 Boise State as a conference champion. That knocks the Big 12 champion out of the bye situation. They still get the automatic berth. They almost fall into the group of 5 category. They become the group of 5 team in a sense, what we anticipated the group of 5, and they would get to the back of the line at number 12. Wouldn't that be something? All right, let's keep it rolling here at the Voice of College Football. We got our guy Jackson stopping by. Jackson, what's going on? The Alabama Crimson Tide moved up a few spots this week.
Oh, yeah. I'm excited about it. And I hope we do get to play Notre Dame in the playoffs because it's always pretty fun watching Alabama play Notre Dame. Especially fun looking back at the history of that matchup. How you doing tonight, Mark?
I am doing great, Jackson. And at this point, we should have the new rankings we do.
Oh, yeah. Darrell
can
sent
post.
it in the chat. Yeah, yup. We got Penn State at 4, Indiana at 5. Ooh, that is going to create quite a ruckus. Well, I mean, who am I kidding? It's already a ruckus because Indiana is not too happy about being below Penn State. But this Saturday, they're definitely going to have their opportunity to show that they should not be below Penn State. But, hey, we got our chance to show the Buckeyes thing or two, which anything can happen in the world of college football. And if they were to beat Ohio State, it would not only be the first time since 1988 that it's happened, but it would also be the first time since 1990 that they didn't beat Indiana.
Yes, they tied in 1990. So nobody's going to be surprised if Ohio State wins this game in whatever fashion. So that's not really the question because Ohio State's going to sit at number 2, barring an Oregon loss, and they're good to go. The question is, okay, Indiana, if they win the game, hey, they could be the number 2 team in the country when the rankings come out at this time next week. If they win the game, if they lose the game, that's going to be the question. How far does the committee drop Indiana once they lose the game? Once they lose a 31-28 game, or once they lose a 42-14 game, what does that do? What does the committee do with those 2 different scenarios?
I think if they get blasted by 4 touchdowns or more, or basically like 3 touchdowns or more, they get knocked down big time. But if it's like a 10-point loss or less, or the game goes to overtime, Indiana is still in the top 10. I feel it's much similar to TCU in 2022, where TCU basically had to win the Big 12 just to make sure they were in. But if they lost the Big 12 title, it had to be by a good margin. If they lost by double digits, they were in trouble. But if the game went to overtime or it was a close loss, then okay, you're good to go, TCU. I could see something of that particular scenario for the Indiana Hoosiers for this season.
Now, when you look at this logically, if Indiana is in fact the number 5 team in the country and their best effort this season is beating Washington, that's their best game because Washington beat Michigan. Washington's got a better record than Michigan, and Indiana beat them worse than they beat Michigan. So the Indiana game or the Washington win is Indiana's best effort of the season. Okay. So they're 10-0. If they lose to Ohio State, who is the number 2 team in the country, and they play extremely well, shouldn't they at least hold their position? If not, move up? Isn't that their best performance of the season? Doesn't that justify and confirm that they're a good football team and that they have earned that ranking? So in my eyes, if you're logically ranking these teams based on their performance, you don't drop Indiana for a loss.
No.
They're actually proving to be the number 5 team in the country if they take Ohio State to the wire.
Yeah, I saw where this guy, Locked On Ole Miss host Stephen Willis, has been going viral for his take about how Indiana shouldn't be the number 5 team because they're a double-digit underdog against Ohio State. And I've been like, I take it that he has not watched a lot of Big Noon Kickoff this year, or Big Ten football for that matter.
Yeah, I really don't care what the point spreads are. The point spreads are the point spreads, and they're for gamblers. They are not for evaluating football teams.
Doesn't matter what the spread is. It matters what you do with it. That is the way to go. Notre Dame, I'm looking forward to that game against Army. It's going to be fun to watch a college football game at Yankee Stadium that's not named the Pinstripe Bowl. That will be a huge one, as a matter of fact. The SEC teams and the Big Ten teams, I think basically if you get to the SEC title game or the Big Ten title game, I don't think anybody has to worry about being left out if you're in the SEC or Big Ten. Because I was watching a little bit of Alabama Mercer before I started the post-game show on Saturday, and I was hearing the broadcasters getting upset about how nobody should be leaving out whoever goes to the SEC title game. It doesn't matter if you win or lose, which tells me right then and there nobody's getting left out in the SEC. And I'm looking at our friend Bill Bender where he's got the tiebreaker results. And I'm looking at Alabama. They've got a great winning percentage, which is 509, and it's greater than Georgia's, Texas A&M, Ole Miss, and Tennessee. That's the common opponent winning percentage that I've got pulled up. And if Alabama can win out, they basically have a shot to get into the SEC title game. And Alabama's it's kind of a debate whether they're going to do you want to get in the SEC title game, or do you just want to win out, sit and chill on championship week, see who you're going to play in the playoffs? And I know Lane Kiffin was talking about that this week.
Yeah, there's a lot of risk reward there because if you win out, you get to the SEC championship game, then of course you can get the bye and you can earn a bye and miss a game. But then you.
Uh-oh, how'd that happen? Good grief. Where did he go? Where did he go? Good grief.
My apologies, everyone. StreamYard just all of a sudden told me that I wasn't welcome any longer. So anyway, yeah, that's the risk reward. That's you risk going to the conference championship game, which of course you don't control in this situation, but you play the best you can and you let the records fall where they may in the tiebreakers, and you get a chance to elevate to a bye, or you risk, depending on how the committee looks at it, you could possibly risk losing out if you get blown out in the SEC championship game. But most likely you're still in the playoff, but you went and played another rough game, you get beat up, and you still have to go and compete in the first round. And maybe after losing an SEC championship game, you're now traveling for that first round game. It's something that's going to have to be really looked at in terms of how much do we penalize teams going to conference championship games, and especially if they lose significantly.
I think basically, well, I mean, it's like I said about the SEC, Big Ten, they'll be fine. But I think for the ACC, SMU, they are a team that's really going to have to win the ACC in order to get into the playoffs, because they can't really rely on past history. They can't really rely on a whole lot, unfortunately. They are going to have to win out. And of course, there's that loss against BYU that's really biting them. So what they may need is BYU to win the Big 12.
Yeah, they did not like the BYU Kansas game. They would love to see BYU get it back on track and strengthen that win or that loss for SMU. Definitely right there.
It would
All right,
be
Jackson.
It would
Yeah,
be
anything
interesting to
else?
see if Arizona State can go from unranked to 24, then boom, they win the Big 12. That'd be an interesting storyline right there.
Yeah, let's say with Arizona State at what are they? 18? Where are they?
24th.
24. Arizona State's as low as 24?
No,
Are they really?
my mistake. 21.
Okay, 21. They're 21. They beat BYU. That's going to give them a nice little boost, depending, of course, on what everybody else does. But let's say they win the 2 to get to the championship game. They're probably going to be in the 14 or 15 range at that point. And then they win the Big 12 championship game. Then, of course, it doesn't matter what they're ranked after that. They're going to get elevated into the playoff.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, that would be the story of the year right there. If whether it's Army makes the playoff or Arizona State makes the playoff, SMU makes the playoff, all those would be great.
That would be huge right there. All the new kids winning their conferences. That would be a huge storyline.
You know, don't count out Georgia Tech against Georgia.
Oh, I'm not.
You know, if we go the opposite way, what if Ohio State loses to Indiana and they miss the playoffs, or Georgia loses to Georgia Tech, they miss the playoffs, and we have some of the heavy hitters that were 1 and 2 in the country to start the season miss the playoffs, and instead we've got the SMUs and Arizona States of the world in the playoffs. It'd be fun.
I talked with a buddy a few months ago about the possibility of seeing Georgia Tech upsetting Georgia, like maybe not this year, but next year or the year after that. Brent Pye's doing a pretty good job at Georgia Tech. It may not be the job that Bobby Dodd was doing there, but he can get him the good heights.
Yep. I know you're getting your Brents flipped there. Yes.
Yeah. Oh,
Brent Key, Brent Pry.
Yeah.
Your Techs mixed up.
Yeah.
Well, Jackson, appreciate you being here.
Oh, thank you for having me on. And Alabama call-in shows Thursday night, where I will reveal who is coming on the 14th edition of Crimson Tide Live. I won't be spoiling till then.
Phenomenal. So listen to that. That's coming up on Thursday on the Alabama show over on the Alabama channel, where Jackson takes your calls on Alabama football every Thursday. Good to see you, Jackson.
Good to see you too, Mark. Stay safe, stay warm. It's cold out.
All right. We will keep it working here at the Voice of College Football. Appreciate everyone calling in. We've got our buddy, the real MVP, stopping by next.
How are you doing this evening?
I am doing great. Good to hear from you. What's on your mind concerning the big rankings reveal?
Yeah, there's a few things that are on my mind about these rankings. First off, Big 12 man is down bad, Mark. They are down astronomically bad. How about being so disrespected that a group of 5 team is placed above you? That's poverty, Mark, right?
Yeah, the entire conference below the top group of 5, and then there are 2 other group of 5s waiting in the wings that are ranked right alongside and very close to your other 2 championship contenders.
Right. You remember how everybody was saying that their conference is as Tim Prangley would call them, the island of misfit toys?
Yes.
he's being proven more and more correct on that statement literally by the hour at this point.
Yeah, well, it's a conference that if we look at what they've done outside the conference, it's just not impressive. Who is the best team? Everybody in the chat, who is the best team that the Big 12 has defeated outside the conference? Maybe Arkansas, maybe Iowa. That's the best I can do right now. Arkansas.
That's probably the best you will do.
Iowa, possibly. Well, we got SMU as well. So we got one of those three. I think they're all pretty much on the same plane.
Right. Also, that's something else I'm going to mention. If head-to-head matters, Mark, then how come SMU is ranked ahead of BYU? I know it doesn't matter in conference place, but as a purity spec rankings person, I think head-to-head should be the most important thing. So if you have two teams right beside each other, the winner should get the tiebreaker. I don't know, just crazy concept here.
Totally agree with that. And we're talking about two very similar conferences. I can't think that there's much separation between those two schedules.
And if anything, the
I
ACC
totally agree
is
with
better.
you, though.
Yeah, and if anything, the ACC is better than the Big 12 this year.
Certainly better at the. It's certainly, I believe, better at the top. I don't know. Maybe they should play. I would like to see some of those games.
Right. But something else, Mark, that also grinded my gears with these rankings was Miami. I have no idea what the committee's doing with Miami. So last week they were ahead of the four SEC teams, the hodgepodge. This week they're in between Alabama and Ole Miss, Georgia, and Tennessee. I didn't even realize there was this gap between Alabama and the rest of the three teams. I don't see how that's justifiable.
Okay, so Alabama jumps 3 spots, surpasses Miami on the strength of a win against Mercer. I'm trying to think what in Alabama's past would warrant, of course, the win against Georgia. So that boosts their resume. However, Georgia beat Tennessee, who beat Bama. So that almost counters that evenly.
And Ole Miss also did beat Georgia, by the way.
Sure, Ole Miss beat Georgia. But I'm just talking about what in Alabama's past, what in their past schedule has changed in terms of the perceptions of those teams that would cause to happen what you're outlining here.
Well, you want me to tell you my conspiracy theory, Mark?
Sure.
Okay, so based on the SEC tiebreakers, it seems like the winner of Texas and Texas A&M is going to get in, and Alabama's getting in. So what this is setting up for is if Texas beats Bama, Alabama with 3 losses would still make the college football playoff. That's what I believe these rankings are telling us today.
Yeah, and it reminds me of other scenarios in past years in which the committee has certainly played the. Well, I don't want to give them too much credit. I was going to say chess, maybe checkers, to set themselves up and to fit their narrative and get to the conclusion that they want by doing similar moves. That again, I would need to be in a room with them to really have them explain, because on the surface, what Alabama did this weekend and what is on their schedule and the performances of the teams on their schedule do not justify leapfrogging Miami. Yeah, I don't know.
Right. So you would have Miami ahead of Alabama. Because for me, I just believe Miami should either be behind these 4 teams or ahead of these 4 teams.
Well,
that's where I'm.
Okay, so that's a great question right there, because when I do my rankings, I get caught in these collections of teams too. And this is the season that it's these 4 because of the obvious games against each other and the round robin of wins between these teams. So they all have the same record. They all play in the same conference. They play very similar schedules. And then, of course, you've got multiple games between all of them that ended up in different ways. And so you can't justify, or you can't honor the head-to-head. It's impossible. because you got too many cross-sectional wins between the four. So it makes sense that you're evaluating them to be so close that you either say, we're going to honor the team with the better record, Miami at 9-1, and elevate them in front of this pack, or we're going to honor the schedule strength of the pack of four and drop Miami below all of them. But the committee is choosing to super analyze. Apparently, they're either doing what you're talking about and they've got an ulterior motive, or if we want to trust them, they have sliced and diced these resumes to such a degree that they have been able to they've been able to wedge Miami in between Alabama and Ole Miss, and somehow justify that Alabama's got a better resume than Miami, but Miami is a better resume than those other three SEC teams, one of which beat Alabama, one of which played to a one-score game against Alabama right down to the wire in Tuscaloosa. And obviously we're talking about Georgia, who also threw around Tennessee this past weekend and did the same to the number 3 team in the country.
Yeah, they also destroyed Clemson, a team in their conference
Yes.
that they might be playing for the ACC championship game.
Yep.
So I would just love to see the committee's explanation for that discrepancy, because I can't, what is Miami's best win as of right now, Mark?
Miami's best win is Duke, 7-3.
Does that come anywhere close to the other teams we're talking about?
No.
And what's their loss?
They lost to a 6-4 Georgia Tech team.
Right. The only loss that's comparable is the Arkansas loss.
Yes.
So they have the worst win and arguably the worst loss.
Ole Miss lost to Kentucky.
Okay. Fair enough. So they have arguably the second worst loss and definitely the worst win. But yet they're ranked ahead of 3 of the SEC teams. To me, that doesn't make any sense. Because what this is telling me is we're going to look at the record and we're going to weigh these cupcake games more than the strength of schedule. I'm sorry, Georgia's got the number 1 strength of schedule. Does that matter? Georgia's played 3 top 20 teams on the road. Georgia went out, scheduled Clemson, and beat the absolute soul to will out of them. Does that matter? Or are we just supposed to play Mercer, San Jose State type teams and just get rewarded for that? What are we trying to do here?
Yeah, they're rewarding a record is what they're doing.
Right, and Josh Payton, he mentioned something about the rankings. I don't know how much Josh Payton you watch, but I believe, he's connected. So when he says things, I believe he says them with intentionality. He's like, you all maybe doubting the SEC, but there's a chance they split. He was mentioned about how the SEC could get mad and be splitting off from the rest of college football because if they don't get their way, and this is all just a farce. And I'm looking at these rankings, and I'm like, if you're Greg Sankey tonight, how are you going to tell your Ole Miss and Georgia, well, shoot, you got to play top 10 teams on the road, but look at Miami. They're playing Duke, Wake Forest, and these cupcake teams. It's just fundamentally not fair to the SEC and Big Ten that we have to go through this, sweating it out. When you got teams losing to trash cans and beating up on trash cans week in and week out.
Well, for as long as you have conference disparity, you're going to have this, because what is Miami supposed to do? Go out and schedule 3 non-conference games against Michigan, Texas, and Oregon. So they're going to play their conference, and there is no way to separate yourself by wins and losses. Like, the best teams in the SEC are going to be minimum 10-2. The top 3 or 4 teams in the SEC every year are going to go 12-0, 11-1, 10-2. So you can't expect a team to go undefeated. So what you're asking Miami to do is go 11-1, and you're still going to make a preference for the 10-2 SEC team. So you know what? You understand what I'm saying? That you've given them no.
This isn't the basket I made, Mark. This is
leeway.
The basket that the ACC has put them in. This isn't my choice. I'm just evaluating the teams. And unfortunately for Miami, they schedule Florida, and Florida's terrible. So they don't get any real credit for that. If you want to be in a weaker conference, you need to schedule teams from the better conferences and win if you want the respect.
Well,
This is
I am going to push back a little bit here because there's some opportunity to do so here. So I generally agree with what you're there. There's no question that Alabama, Ole Miss, Georgia, and Tennessee have far more difficult schedules than Miami. However, the common denominator is Florida. Miami beat Florida much worse than Tennessee did, who got taken to overtime, much worse than Georgia did. And we'll see
that is
about Ole
fair,
Miss
and
and
that
Florida this weekend.
yeah, I know, and that is fair, and that does need to be factored in. But I think when we take into account the overall resume, I think it is clear and obvious that those three teams have a much stronger resume, even with the additional loss, than what Miami has.
Yeah, I've got Miami, I believe, at 11. I'd have to pull up
Yeah.
my rankings.
I think that's where most people have. Also, something else that the committee's tipping us off into, Marcus, if you scroll near the very bottom of the rankings, the Missouri Tigers are just like the Grim Reaper in terms of these rankings. They just somehow are just there and just always in the background, ever present and lurking. How in the world is Missouri still ranked? Missouri's not a good football team this year. They're just not.
Okay, well, if you're going to take their entire body of work, I tend to agree with you. But if we're going to take if we're going to take the committee's evaluation as of last week to be valid and then tack on going to Columbia and losing in the final 15 seconds to South Carolina, then we've got to give Missouri some kind of game performance credit for that. So I don't have any issue with them moving how many spots? Let's see. I've got so many windows.
They stayed
open.
the same.
I'm going from team to team here because I'm trying to do some other things at the same time. So I don't necessarily have an issue with. I don't have an issue with Missouri and what was done based on this past weekend.
Right.
Now, before
My
that,
problem
I
is
don't
just
know.
My problem is the totality.
Well, I got Missouri at 22.
Oh,
I've
well,
got Pitt at 25, Kansas State at 24, Illinois 23, Mizzou 22, Colorado 21. Let me see here. Give me a second. So if you can follow this mess, because I got to keep track of the wins and losses. So again, yeah, Pitt, Kansas State, Illinois. I got Mizzou a spot ahead of the committee, and I understand they looked awful against Alabama. They also missed their starting quarterback, Brady Cook, and their best running back, Nate Noel, through much of that. And again, that South Carolina game went down to the wire. Anyway, Colorado at 21. I got Clemson at 20. There's Iowa State at 19, Arizona State at 18. I've got South Carolina at 17, despite the 3 losses. I think they're really good. Army at 16, Boise State at 15. And then I come in with SMU. Again, I honor the win by BYU. They're at 13. There's Texas A&M at 12. I got Miami at 11, Notre Dame at 10. Then this is how I come through with that SEC pack. I've got Bama 6, Ole Miss 7, Georgia 8, Tennessee 9. And then my top 5 are different, obviously, than the committee.
right, but you've got for the SEC 4, you've got the exact same order as the playoff committee. It's just they inserted Miami somehow right in the thick of it between Alabama and Ole Miss, which doesn't make any sense to me at all.
Yeah, I think I explained this, but just to be clear, I did my best to think I can't just move these teams together as a 4-pack just to do it. And I looked at the Miami situation in particular and Notre Dame to say, is there a reason? Is there a reason to separate these 4 and wedge in another team that I can justifiably say they have a worse resume than those 1 or 2 or 3 teams, and they've got a better resume than those 1 or 2 or 3 teams. Therefore, they should be wedged in there. And it was impossible for me to separate those 4 teams from the SEC because they've just been their resumes are just so similar.
Correct. I completely agree with you. Now, I saw we got a super chat, Mark, with Dave. He's believing the Missouri thing is just another example of SEC bias, Mark.
Yeah. So, Dave, appreciate you being here, Minnesota Dave. How in the heck is Missouri still ranked? Can you say SEC bias? I know you could. So, do we want to look at Missouri's resume versus Illinois, who is also 7-3 and ranked right behind them? Like, do we think Illinois' got a great resume? Who else is 7-3 that's got some kind of great resume? Syracuse. You start to run out of 8-2 teams. That one thing that I do when I release the top 25 that actually makes sense is I run down. These are how many undefeated teams there are: 1-loss teams, 2-loss teams, 3-loss teams, and I've gotten to the point of starting to count 4-loss teams because you run out of 2-loss teams. So you got to rank some 3-loss teams. Well, Missouri, let's compare them to Illinois. Missouri beat Oklahoma, Auburn, Vandy. It's more about Missouri playing some decent teams and losing than it is winning, granted. But Illinois' beaten Michigan, 5-5 Michigan, 5-5 Nebraska in overtime. The Vandy win's a better win than any of those wins. And the BC
they beat
wins
Kansas as well.
And the BC wins about just as good. Kansas
not a
is
whole lot of
4-6.
Yeah, they had a close loss against Iowa, which is something. And
Iowa.
Yeah, that Purdue game is unexplainable. That Purdue game is probably the worst performance out of
there
any
you go.
top 25.
Yeah. Illinois did not play Iowa. They lost to Penn State by 2 touchdowns. They lost to Oregon by a zillion, and they lost to Minnesota. Those 3 teams are obviously Penn State and Oregon are extremely good, but the Penn State performance was okay. They stayed in the game. The Oregon game, they got blown off the field, and Minnesota is a 6-4 team. The 3 teams that Missouri lost to are consistently better. They didn't lose to a Minnesota team.
Right. And has Missouri had any close performance like Illinois has against Kansas, Nebraska, and Purdue?
No.
Right. To me, that's the difference. It's not just who they lost to, but it's how they've looked in their wins they've played, especially against Purdue, because Purdue is just Purdue. I mean, they're horrendous this year.
And believe me, I take no joy, nor am I really sticking up for Missouri. So just if you start to look through this and then you go off of that 25, and so the teams after 25, this is not how I have them ranked. I've got them grouped by how many losses they have. Syracuse and Duke are the only 2. They're the only 2 teams in the Power 5 that have 3 losses after that. Then you're starting to dip into 6-4 teams. So it's difficult to keep Missouri out of the top 25 unless you want to throw in a bunch of 4-loss teams. Should they be replaced by Duke or Syracuse?
I think you made a good argument, Mark. I didn't think I could be changed my mind on this, but you've changed my mind.
These teams start to beat each other at this point in the season, and they just accumulate mediocre records, and there's nowhere to go for a sterling 8-2 team to finish out your top 25.
Yeah, I have to say you're right, Mark.
I was even looking at 6-4 teams thinking, okay, how good are they? Is there a 6-4 team that's really played well? Not quite, but we're getting close to that. Obviously, once we get to the end, 2 weeks from now, there will be 8-4 teams in the top 25, whether it be mine or the AP or the committees.
Final thing I'll ask you, Mark, and this is going back to the beginning of my soliloquy, is the Big 12, Mark. There is a realistic chance they're not going to get a single team in. Not one. If Army beats Notre Dame. That's all that realistically needs to happen. If that happens, I feel like that's detrimental to the sport because you're telling one of the Power 4 conferences in the first year of the system that they don't matter. I mean, we know the Big 12 doesn't matter, but it's nice for them to think they matter. What type of precedent do you think that would set, leaving one of the Power 4 conferences out completely?
Well, I think it sets a precedent to just let us know that that our assumption that the that college football is as regimented in its power structure as we thought is not necessarily the case, and that this, it would only prove the point that I argued ever since we had this realignment settle down to what it currently is. And when I looked at the Big 12, this is a fun conference. It is a really fun conference. If you are looking to watch 41 to 38 games late Saturday night from Lubbock, Texas, this is a fun conference to watch. You don't know who's going to win the game. You cannot forecast that Arizona State's going to go from 3 wins to possibly a conference championship, and that Utah is going to collapse, go to the conference championship game one year and then plummet, even though they've got quarterback back, rushing champion back, receivers, 21 of 22 starters, and they're 0-7 in the conference. It's just every game is either down to the wire, or it's just this complete slap in the face, like, how did that happen? What in the world just happened kind of game. But that doesn't register on the national scene. These fun Arizona State UCF games.
I get you, Mark. But hey, I'll be laughing all the way to the bank because I'm going to enjoy the meltdown. That's what I'll be doing, because the Big 12 fans have been way high. They were talking about in the beginning of the season, midway through the season, Mark, 3 teams getting in from that conference.
Well,
so it would be some type of poetic justice for them to get literally nobody in there.
You need Army to come through.
Yeah, and I need Arizona State to beat BYU.
Yeah.
Probably.
Yeah.
And I mean, how crazy is that to imagine to happen?
Where does
all we need is Notre
Army
Dame to realize who they have been for the last 35, 40 years. The Army's only third.
Yeah, one of the more unpredictable aspects of all this is when there is a team like Army and their record is just built on fluff, and then they face the moment of truth, what the committee would do with that win. Would they just think, okay, well, that's a nice win, but obviously we're going to dock Notre Dame significantly and they're done. And there's this balancing act of, okay, did Army just beat one of the best teams in the country, or is Notre Dame not quite as good? Obviously, Army would be rewarded significantly, but are they going to then suddenly going to have a resume that's better than all these teams in front of them? They may only move 4 or 5 spots because they may run into, even if they go to 10-0, that doesn't throw them to number 5 in the country.
I just need them to get to 14. That's all I need is to get them to 14.
That's about where that hits. Yeah, they would probably run into SMU.
Right. I just need them to get to 14, and then I'm safe. It's not like I need them to get even to 10. So I think it's a scenario that would be fun to look at. I don't think it's very likely to happen, but I think it would be a great scenario to have happen.
And again, just to compare that with like Tennessee losing to Georgia last weekend, when teams are in the SEC and we have a pretty good read on how good they are, and they mount these strong schedules against, at the very worst, top 40 teams in the SEC, that when they lose, they don't get moved much because Tennessee just lost to Georgia. So what did Tennessee move? Would they move 2 spots? They probably moved 2 spots here.
Yeah, something like that.
Okay. As opposed to what is going to happen to Indiana? Because if they lose that game against Ohio State and they lose it respectably, that can be interpreted as, shouldn't the number 5 team in the country lose on the road to the number 2 team in the country by a field goal? Shouldn't they just stay where they're at? Or even it could be justified that that's a performance that's keeping Penn State in the top 4 in the country. Wouldn't that be justified as a remarkable performance that they should actually get rewarded for? So those are the kind of situations where the committee becomes a wild card as to how they evaluate the team that finally hits the moment of truth, and what did they do to that moment, and how much are we going to value it or devalue it because they didn't get it done, or they got completely blown off the field.
I've been saying it I think I might have been one of the first people to say it now, Mark, that Indiana, if they lose this game by 42-10 type margin, they're going to be left out of the playoffs. And I mean, look at Penn State. There's a reason, in my opinion, they're ranked ahead of Indiana. It's because it's the committee signaling a lack of confidence in Indiana. I think the committee is projecting a bit and suspecting Indiana's going to lose to Ohio State by more than what Penn State lost to Ohio State by. That's the only reason I can justify Indiana being ranked behind Penn State as of right now.
So let's do this, DeReal, and then I'm going to take other callers. If Indiana loses this weekend, and it's neither a blowout nor a down-to-the-wire game, it's a respectable loss, but they still lose 35-21. They are clearly not in Ohio State's class. Okay. Who else here plays a competitive game? Like, nobody's going to lose any of these games here. Like this SEC pack, let's say Notre Dame gets by Army, all that. Indiana's going to drop behind. Their 10-1 is going to definitely drop behind this collection of 9-2 SEC teams.
Well, then they're out. If they do that, then they're out automatically because you have the group of 5 ahead of them.
And they're going to have a decision to make between them and Boise State, who, again, is still going to earn a spot. Yeah, then it's we're judging, and even beyond that, you got to figure Miami or SMU's in. The other is not. Yeah,
it's sad to see for Indiana, but unfortunately, when you play nobody in your conference, and when you have these conferences be so big, and you play, I think I saw a stat, they play 7 of the 8 worst Big Ten teams this year so far.
Yeah,
like
sounds right.
when you play that type of a schedule, and then you play, who knows name school here and who names no school there, this is the type of result you're finding yourself in. Honestly, if I'm Indiana, I'm just happy to be in these type of conversations. And I think the final thing I'll say, and I saw this, one of the reasons last year Florida State was left out of the playoffs, I saw an article by Dennis Dodd wrote it, and he got an anonymous committee member to say one of the reasons Florida State was left out of the playoffs was because they said, do we really think Florida State a national championship? And they all said no. Or they said no. I don't know if they all said no, but that guy said no. Yeah. And I think that's what's going to happen with Indiana. I hate that standard. I don't agree with that standard. But if we're using that standard last year and we look at that standard this year, can Indiana win the national championship? No. And they'll be left out for a team that can win it, like a Tennessee.
Well, it's not like the committee is hiding that. They say that there's an eyeball test component to this. So that's what that is. Right. All right, DeReal.
Yeah, it's good talking to you. Thank you for making me a mod, Mark.
Appreciate you being here. Of course. All right, let's keep it rolling. We've got Rob checking in. Rob, what's going on?
Hey, Mark. How you doing?
Good.
Hey, so, I think I'm not sure what the committee is looking at with some of these teams. Look, I'm a Notre Dame fan, obviously. I don't think we should be number 6 right now. Not to say that, I think there's several teams in the top 6 that are overrated. I think Texas is overrated. I think Penn State's overrated. I think Notre Dame's overrated. I think Indiana is going to play it. Like, we're going to find out all we need to know about Indiana real soon. They're going to play Ohio State. And if they hang with Ohio State, then again, I think if they're within like a score or maybe like a score or 2, like let's say Ohio State gets like a late score, it's a 1-score game going into the fourth quarter that Ohio State gets a score at the end of the game, whatever. But it's a pretty competitive game. I think that's enough to where Indiana should not be knocked out of the playoffs, or at least the contentions.
So when you say Texas, Penn State, and Indiana are overrated,
no, I said Texas, Penn State, and Notre Dame.
Oh, okay. Texas, Penn State, and Notre Dame. So they are all what, 3 or 4 spots too high? Then who is moving up? Are all those SEC teams? Are you going to rank them like number 3, 4 in the country that have 2 losses?
Well, here's the thing. I think Texas is kind of, a lot of people aren't talking about Texas, but they're kind of the SEC version of Indiana in a lot of ways.
Yes.
Their schedule has been very easy, especially for an SEC team. They've had it the easiest out of pretty much all the SEC teams. I mean, you look at Oklahoma is probably like cursing the skies right now. They're, their first season in the SEC, and look at their schedule compared to Texas. It's like completely hilarious.
Yep. I posted a video about it before the season even started.
Yeah, I saw that video too. Yeah. So I think Texas is in a lot of ways like the SEC version of Indiana. They just haven't really played. Like, yeah, Michigan, their win against Michigan was great, but like Michigan is not who we thought they were at that point in the season. Like at that point in the season, it's like, wow, look what Texas just did to Michigan. But that's not such a big feat now. So I mean, and then obviously Oklahoma's fallen off the rails, so that win doesn't mean much. I mean, they don't have that one really marquee win that you can hang your hat on, and obviously we've got that blowout loss to Georgia. So and then Penn State again, they've done, like their claim to fame is losing to Ohio State in a fairly competitive game, but nobody watching that game, at least me, and I think a lot of people watched that game, and I don't think a lot of people thought Penn State was going to win that game. Like Ohio State was in control for the most part, at least it felt like, because the Penn State offense couldn't do anything. Like they just couldn't do anything against Ohio State's defense. And then of course, Notre Dame. Look, Notre Dame's been crushing people, but that loss to NIU is a freaking like kryptonite for them. It's just hanging over their head. It's dragging down the narrative. So anything they've done good, it doesn't really matter to a lot of people because of the one terrible loss that they had. I think that terrible loss is worth like I would probably put Notre Dame behind Alabama and Georgia, and probably Ole Miss too. I would say Alabama, Georgia, Ole Miss. I would put them all ahead of Notre Dame right now, because I think on a neutral field, I'm not saying Notre Dame for sure loses that game, because obviously if Alabama plays the way they did against Vanderbilt, Notre Dame wins. If Georgia plays the way they did against Ole Miss, then Notre Dame has a shot. But I think overall, like any given Saturday, I think on average at a neutral site, I think those teams probably beat Notre Dame in a fairly competitive game. That's just my opinion.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with you. I would take Alabama and Ole Miss and Georgia over Notre Dame. Maybe not Tennessee. That's probably where I'd land on that.
Honestly, Ole Miss to me is they're a couple of plays away, and this is like a cliche thing, but they could very well be undefeated right now. I mean, they really blew that LSU game, which is inexplicable to me as much as LSU has fallen off the map. But I mean, Ole Miss, they're to me the scariest team in the SEC right now. Like if I'm Georgia, if I'm Alabama, I don't want to play Ole Miss. Yeah, I mean, obviously we saw what Ole Miss did to Georgia, so that's kind of a silly example. But yeah, I mean, I think right now Ole Miss is peaking at the right time, and they're going to be a scary team going into the playoffs if they can hold it together.
Yeah, they're in good shape. They go to Florida. That's not going to be a cakewalk. It could be a tricky game this Saturday. Then they've got their rivalry game, but Mississippi State's the worst team in the SEC. So they should be fine.
Right. Yeah, and going back to what you said about Missouri, I agree with you. I think Missouri should be ranked. I didn't think that probably last week, but after seeing what they did to South Carolina, very competitive in that game, I thought they were going to get the doors blown off. I thought South Carolina was going to eat them alive, and that just didn't happen. And of course, we saw what South Carolina was able to do to Texas A&M, and the fact that Texas A&M destroyed Missouri. It's the SEC is such a weird circle jerk. I mean, every team has some kind of weird up over some other team in the conference. It's just crazy, which actually leads me to a point that I think the conferences are just way too big. They're just way too big, because this is why we're getting these kind of schedule discrepancies with teams like Texas having
Yep.
such an easy cakewalk through the SEC. And you got Georgia, who had an absolute gauntlet to go through, and Florida for that matter, and Oklahoma. I mean, some of these teams in the SEC are just having this ridiculous, gauntlet they got to go through. And same with the Big Ten, right? Like Indiana. Indiana didn't have to play anybody. Now they are going to have to play Ohio State, thankfully for them, actually, because that's their one, that's the one thing that people can, if they win that game or are competitive against Ohio State, people will say, okay, well, they got their test. But other than that, I mean, some teams have just been cakewalking through these conferences, because these conferences are so huge that it's impossible to get like any really meaningful cumulative data.
Creates two things: what you just outlined, as opposed to, let's say, the most recent best example of like scheduling is, of course, in the Big 12 with 10 teams playing 9 conference games. They all played exactly the same schedule. The only thing that could be separated was because they played 9 conference games. Some teams played 5 at home and 4 on the road. The other ones played vice versa. But besides that, everybody just so there was no discrepancy. Everybody played the same schedule. Even the Pac-12, as recently as them playing 9 games in a 12-team league, you're only missing 2 teams. Therefore, their schedules were very, you could make a discrepancy that, so-and-so didn't have to play Oregon, something like that, but they were so close. But yeah, when you got 18 teams in a conference and you're playing 9 conference games, you're missing 8 teams. And to try to find common opponents, like I was looking at, I forget if this was in the ACC, and there are teams that hardly, I think SMU and Miami only have a couple common opponents, like 2 or 3. And so then that's what it creates is, well, the first thing, the highlight you were getting to was obviously the discrepancy in the strength of the schedules, which is not fair. And then I'm getting to, because you're not playing teams that you're competing with for a championship, then you are obviously getting into tiebreaker scenarios that don't involve head-to-head. They just involve these crazy, like, how well did you do against common opponents, and who had the highest seeded win, and who played against the teams with the best winning percentage. And that's always one that's like, okay, you win the tiebreaker because the teams you played had a 43% winning percentage and against 41%. Big deal. That's really how we're going to decide a conference championship spot. The other thing that came to light for me, Rob, in looking at this and doing these situational videos the last few weeks, and this makes sense, is that because of all the factors we just listed, it shouldn't be surprising that the teams at the top of these leagues play the worst records. Their opponent's winning percentage, which obviously if you took everyone into account would be 50%, you're talking like Indiana's was 16 or 18 games under 500.
Ouch. Yeah.
All of the teams I looked at, nobody had a plus 500 composite schedule in the conference. None of these conferences, none of the teams competing for championships. That kind of tells you they're taking advantage of bad schedules.
Yeah, that's eye-opening. I didn't realize it was that skewed in that direction.
I wouldn't have guessed it either.
Wow. Yeah. Well, and that's just, that's just how this goes. I mean, my eyes popped open when I realized that all these teams were moving to the SEC and the Big Ten, and it's basically like a Power 2 now, with obviously the ACC and the Big 12 kind of, trying to get a seat at the table as well. But we know who's really driving the vehicle there in the college football playoff committee. It's those 2 conferences, and they're just so big, and there's so much money to be made. It's kind of a, it's a bit of a shame, I would say. I mean, like you said, the Big 12, they're doing it right. I mean, if you could get every conference to have, that kind of level of competition.
Well, they did.
Yeah,
they did it right before they expanded.
Right. It's just you just wished, and people are going to be like, oh, what's this Notre Dame guy talking about conferences for? Well, I mean, I'm in favor of Notre Dame joining a conference at this point. And, you know, I'm okay with them. I mean, I'm okay either way. I'm okay if they don't, because that's tradition, that's history. And they've got to, like, in some ways, they're a little penalized because they're not in a conference, because they'll never be able to get one of those guaranteed, you know, conference championship buys. But on the other hand, I mean, like Lane Kiffin was talking about, when you're sitting at home, you know, while someone else has to go and sweat out a conference, you know, championship game, it's not really fair. Because if you lose that conference championship and you were good enough to get there in the first place, it's kind of a slap in the face. I think Josh Pate and Danny Cannell were talking, and Danny Cannell said that he doesn't believe a conference championship loser should really drop in the rankings. And I kind of agree with him, because I feel like it depends, right? If it's a competitive game, I don't really think you should drop. Kind of like what you were talking about Indiana earlier. If Indiana loses to Ohio State coming up in this next game, well, like you said, Indiana's the 5th ranked team in the country. Shouldn't they lose to Ohio State? Now, if they get boat raced, that's one thing. But if they lose a close game, I really don't think they should drop much, because they are not ranked higher. It's not like they're underperforming at that point.
And if they didn't drop much, let's say they dropped to 7, I wouldn't have an issue with that, even though I think it's completely logical to say that they shouldn't drop at all.
Right.
If anything, it justifies their ranking more than all their wins. That loss would justify how good they are more than winning those games.
I think you're spot on with that, Mark. I think if they're in a close game, or you know, or like I said, as long as they're not boat raced, I don't think they should drop, because that, just like you said, it proves their ranking. Okay, yeah, they weren't as good as number 2. They're number 5. They lost a competitive game. Why should they drop? It's how the committee basically foresaw that happening.
Yeah, beating Michigan State like everybody else is in the Big Ten does not prove that you're one of the 5 best teams in the country.
Right. All right. Well, it's awesome talking to Mark. I'm going to let you go. I know you got other callers. So
thanks, Rob. Appreciate it.
No problem.
Good stuff here at the Voice of College Football. Great calls out of everyone, as always. And we've got about 260 people on the line, maybe not on your particular channel, but we have simulcasted this out to as many channels as possible, all the channels that are involved with teams that are in the playoff chase. Now, we couldn't simulcast all of them because we've got a limit, but we simulcast to do as many as possible. So we appreciate you being here at the Voice of College Football. And keep in mind that I released a book. So we are talking to avid college football fans, folks. So as avid college football fans, check this out. Disputed National Champions, Historical Reset of College Football's 1990s. We went through every year of the 1990s. We dissected it. We went through the schedule. We went through the season, the preseason hype, who was supposed to be great, how the season played out. We went through the postseason results and how those were interpreted, what the final polls looked like, whether those were valid, who got left out, who got screwed. And then we talk about the aftermath of each season in regards to was it the dawning of a new era in college football because a particular coach or team rose to the top, or was it the end of an era? What was the impact of that particular season going forward? And then it's not just a historical book, because that was not my intent, but I chose the 1990s because I believe it to be the most impactful decade in college football in terms of defining how we name a champion. So we went from the strictly poll era of the AP and the coaches poll in 1990 to the Bowl Coalition, which what that did was it ensured that number 1 and number 2 would play if they didn't play in the Pac-12 or the Big Ten. But I won't explain that. Then we get to the BCS era, which launched in 1998, and then on into the playoff eras later. So we take the results of every season in the 1990s, and this is where the fun comes in. We placed those seasons into different eras. We took 1990s results and there were no conference championship games then. We let you know these are the teams that would have played in the conference championship games. These would have been the conference championship games. And then this is what it would have looked like 7 years later in the BCS formula. This is what it would have looked like in the 4-team college football playoff, who would have made it, and the 12 team that we're currently in. So you can look at every 1990s season from 1990 through 99 and say, under the 12-team format, this is what would have happened. And then we even projected toward the proposed 14-team playoff. So I had fun writing it. I think you'll have fun reading it. And you just go to Amazon, look up Disputed National Champions. You can grab the link. It's in the description section of the video we are currently on. Muley stopping by here, the voice of college football. What's going on?
Hey, Mark, how's it going?
I am doing well. How are you?
I'm doing well. Getting that book, as you mentioned. I've been meaning to get that.
I appreciate it.
Yeah, I definitely want to read that. So, yeah, anyways, what are these rankings, man? What are these rankings? Like, I've been listening to this call, and I've listened to the points that DeRio made or the previous call, the Notre Dame dude, and whatever it may be. I think DeRio made an interesting point about putting Bama above Miami, where it's like if Bama loses in the SEC championship game, because if they win out, it looks like they're gonna probably make it, based on like common opponents, their common opponents' records, right? My thing is, there shouldn't be an SEC team being left out for losing in the SEC championship game.
How about the other championship games?
That's where it gets interesting, because then it becomes a bit hypocritical, because there's only a few spots, right? And yeah, I feel like when it comes to SEC and Big Ten, that should be. But then it's like, if someone comes and says, "Oh, well, what about the ACC?" Because personally, for one, I don't see why Miami is one. They're ranked in the middle of the heap of SEC teams. Two, they're ranked above Ole Miss, Georgia. And while we're at it, why is Miami so much higher than SMU? Because they beat Louisville, Duke. You know who else beat Louisville and Duke?
Yes.
SMU. Yeah. It's funny. And SMU had a 3-loss. Like, yeah, BYU didn't have the best game this weekend. They're still a top 25 team. They still didn't lose to a Georgia Tech team that couldn't throw the ball.
Yes, SMU is a better loss than Miami. Absolutely, They do.
Right. So I don't know why this. I mean, I know the obvious answer is like the brand bias or whatnot. I get it, but yeah, like what, like, because I'm sorry if Miami. I feel like at least with Bama, they've proven enough to where even if they do take a loss, the results before the SEC championship is fine. Whereas I'm looking at Miami, your two best wins is Louisville and Duke. Louisville was looking good until they dropped the ball against freaking Stanford of all teams. So now I don't know how to evaluate that. Duke, well, even Duke is a 3-loss, but they did lose to Georgia Tech, I believe, and by like 11 points or 12 points. Yeah, so I think that's so. And then Georgia Tech also beat Miami. I don't know. And then when you throw in another wrench, if Army comes, because I'm okay with ranking Army at 19 at the moment, but if they come and beat Notre Dame, they should get a good boost. They deserve to get a good boost, because let's say they win out. That means they would have to beat a ranked Tulane team as well in their conference championship game. They'll have to beat Navy at the end of the year, which I know Navy has kind of, like, they got destroyed by Tulane and they've been losing lately. They got destroyed by Notre Dame as well. But regardless, you beat 2 ranked teams and then you still would be left out. The point of expanding these playoffs is to give these other teams more opportunities. But then now we have this huge pile up in the SEC, and then the Big Ten, the teams at the top are feasting. So yeah, I don't know what I'm just looking at this and it's like, okay, BYU dropped, and why? I can understand you might drop them below like SMU if you want to say, okay, well, that was earlier in the season. It was a close loss. SMU's been playing better, but they put them right next to each other. If they're going to be right next to each other, why is BYU below SMU? And I don't see anything because I also saw people saying, well, BYU has had so many close games. They had close games against Oklahoma State and Utah. Those were the two, and SMU. But like, can you fault them for being close with a top 15 team?
Yeah, they shouldn't be penalized. They should be given credit for that one. The other ones, they should be penalized. I get that.
Right. But I've been seeing like people making the thing that BYU has had so many close games. They've had 2 close games against Oklahoma. I think the Baylor was a one score game at the end, but they were blowing out Baylor, and then Baylor made a comeback. Who, by the way, Baylor is not a bad team, for one. So, other than that, off the top, I'm pretty sure all the other games they've handled pretty well. They blew out Kansas State. I mean, then again, I don't know what's happening to Kansas State and Avery Johnson, but that's a different discussion. But yeah, I'm just looking at this and I'm just saying, like, where's the reason? Like, why is Miami like so? Yeah.
Well, the thing that we cannot factor in sitting here discussing ourselves without talking to a committee member, and they would never explain it to us, is that there are football minds in that room and there's an eye test. So there's sheer metrics and then there's an eye test. And that's where somebody or 2 or 3 or 4 out of 8 out of the 13, whatever the number, is saying Cam Ward and that offense, when they got on a roll, they are arguably the best offense in college football, and they've got the talent to pull off an upset against an Oregon, Ohio State, Georgia. Therefore, they're of more value than SMU.
I get that, but they also have a defense that lets Cal put 35 up on them. And going back to the close win thing, Miami has more close wins and scares than BYU. So, sorry, I'm just kind of freaking baffled by that. So, yeah,
I've got Miami. Let's see, where are they? They're at 8. I've got them 3 spots lower myself.
So yeah, and that's what made me realize what Daryl was saying. Like, if both Miami lose in the championship game and Bama lose, Bama will have the edge over Miami. So I see, if you think about it, which they should. They should, if that was the scenario, they should. But regardless, Miami shouldn't be that high to begin with.
All right, Muley, you got any other questions or comments to make?
I do, but I'll let the other callers. I just went on a huge rant without even
call back anytime.
All right. Have a good one. You too. Bye.
Appreciate y'all being here at the Voice of College Football. Please consider the Super Chat contribution to keep us going here at the Voice of College Football. Use the Amazon link in the description section as well. Check out my book. The link is in the description section. Just one other note concerning something that Muley brought up would be the whole approach to conference championship games and penalizing teams or not penalizing teams. And I don't think that I'm not going to come hard at, this is a pure data point and this is what it is. And it's just another game that needs to be evaluated. And if you lose 41-10 in a conference championship game, bam, get rid of you or whatever. Because I understand the argument that why are we penalizing a team that is advanced above all these teams in their conference to make the conference championship game, and maybe they get blown out, they have a bad night, they played one of the top 3 or 4 teams in the country, whatever the case might be, and we're penalizing them. So I understand that argument that we shouldn't penalize a conference championship game loser, but also it's a football game that's played. It's a data point that has to be taken into consideration. If we are valuing and crediting the victory and the dominance of the victory for the team that wins the conference championship, they just won the conference championship based on that performance. Therefore, there is always the flip side to every football performance. There is the performance of the other team that was on the field with that team. So it has to be evaluated. It just has to. And that's another point that I brought up when this 12-team playoff was announced. And I went through the last 15 seasons, and especially the last 10, because we had a playoff and a playoff committee with rankings. I looked at the rankings pre-conference championship games and post-conference championship games, and you would not believe the number of Wisconsins out there that were safely in the playoff at number 10, let's say, before the conference championship game, but lost to go from 10-2 to 10-3 and drop to number 15 in the country, and therefore they would have missed the playoffs. Now, the question is, would the committee treat that differently with the playoff spot on the line versus just, hey, we're ranking teams, and whether they're 12 or 15 or whatever, it's not that big a deal. We'll never know that. All right. Right here at the Voice of College Football, we got Adam stopping by.
Hey, Mark, how's it going?
It's going just fine. How are you?
Okay, thanks for having me on. I'll just be a few minutes. So I'm looking at these rankings, and I had a few thoughts. I don't think Oregon should be number one, and I think the Wisconsin game showed that their offense can be stopped and that they are not nearly as good as some think. I think Penn State at number 4, that just baffles me. I do not think Penn State has the offense that's going to allow them to compete in any meaningful way. I don't think Indiana deserves to be 5th yet. We'll wait to see what happens in Columbus. I think Miami is ranked too high, and I wouldn't have Boise at number 12. I mean, they beat UNLV by 5 and they beat Nevada by 7. And I put together my own rankings, which are very different. But I want to hear your thoughts on first, what you think of these rankings and where you think they may be problematic.
Well, so it's much like anything else. I don't think you can do too much criticism unless you fill out your own, as you have, because I get criticism for my top 25 all the time because it's easy to see. And then the Missouri example from a few calls ago, once we started to analyze who's around Missouri and who would replace them, well, there's nobody there. So if we start to drop these teams, then I'm guessing you're taking that block of SEC teams and you're moving them up to fill those spots.
Yeah, well, I do have different rankings, and I'm sure many would disagree, but I've got Ohio State at number 1. I do think they're the best team in the country because what I'm looking at are who are the best teams based on what I'm seeing on the field. Number 2, I've got Oregon. Number 3, I have Alabama. Alabama looks hot right now, and Milroe is clicking. And if that offense keeps clicking and the defense keeps improving, they're going to be a tough team to beat. I've got Texas at 4. I've got Ole Miss at 5. I think they're a dangerous team. And at 6, I've got Penn State. 7, I've got Indiana. 8, I've got Georgia. 9, I've got Notre Dame. 10, I have Miami. 11, I have Tennessee. And I'm going to tell you, number 12, and people are going to think this is crazy too, South Carolina. Tim Tebow just said last week that's the team that nobody wants to play. Now, they have 3 losses, but they're on a 4-game winning streak, 3 of the 4 of which they won by double digits, including over A&M and over a Vanderbilt team that defeated Alabama. So what are your thoughts on that, on those rankings and about South Carolina?
Well, you're taking a more subjective approach. So basically, you are ranking teams based on your confidence of how well they will play in this playoff and how much talent they have and your evaluation of their play on the field. And aside from what the metrics tell us and what the results tell us. Now, obviously, all those teams are in the running. You didn't just grab a 5-5 team from somewhere and say, I really think they're great.
Right.
So all those teams are only a few spots off, but you're implementing your confidence level of those teams for one thing.
Well, I'm basing it on what I see on the field. And, the Vandy victory by South Carolina was on the road. Okay. They did beat an A&M team that, is pretty darn good. They're on a 4-game winning streak. And Tim Tebow last week, when he said that's the one team that nobody in the country wants to play, goes to my theory that when you talk about assessing performance over the course of a season, it depends on how you define over the course of a season. I define it as looking at the entire body of work. We're placing emphasis on the upward trajectory of a team. I mean, let's look at some of the committee members. Ward Manuel. Okay. He's the Michigan AD. You have Kelly Whiteside, a professor at Montclair State University. I know a lot of professors, and I'm not so sure about that one. The AD at Miami University of Ohio. So, and the AD at the Naval Academy. So why do those individuals who also use subjective assessments have any more qualifications to make a judgment than you do or I do?
I think what they're looking for is for those committee members to be split basically between the academias and their studious approach to metrics and analytics and breaking those down, and then bringing in football people to talk about what these teams look like on tape and merging those two philosophies. And it's more nuanced than that, but those are the basic two approaches that they're trying to meld into these committees.
Yes, well, I would keep academics as far away from the real world as possible, and I hope none of my colleagues hear me saying this. But, I read your book, and I will tell everybody on this show, the book is excellent. The writing is excellent. The analysis is first rate. But the reason I think you have that great book is because the metrics are so flawed. And that is Exhibit A for my explanation about why relying on these metrics yields disputed and sometimes very imperfect results that would otherwise be avoided if we used a little more common sense and looked at the teams who are the best now, like the NCAA does in college basketball.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry.
Adam. I just wanted to say another evaluation I have of your approach, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that you are, while taking the entirety of the season into account, you're very much looking for the teams that are playing the best football now.
That's correct, because the best teams now are ipso facto the best teams. That doesn't mean that the season doesn't matter.
Yep.
It means that I'm defining the word matter or over the course of a season to emphasize an upward trajectory. And I think that yields a fairer result. And I think it yields a result where the best teams are truly playing for the national championship. These rankings do not make any sense. And your book highlights the flaws in what has gone on in college football. And those flaws continue because we have people who are making safe choices. We have people who are making choices based on metrics that do not yield the best teams. And I would submit that South Carolina should be in there, that Indiana, Miami should be lower, that Boise shouldn't be in there, and that Oregon is not number 1, and Penn State has no business at number 4. But again, those are just my thoughts, and I could be wrong. So thanks for listening to me, and always for a great show.
Adam, appreciate you being here. Thank you for your support. Adam's live with the Rutgers Show every Monday at 7 Eastern, correct?
Correct.
Yes. Monday at 7 Eastern and post game on Saturday.
Have a great night. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Adam. And just to highlight another thing that Adam was talking about there that I think is an interesting point, and there's not a perfect answer to it. Do you reward the season? Now, fortunately, most of these teams stay consistent, fairly consistent throughout the season. The best teams in the country stay consistent. It's not like Oregon got off to this horrendous start and just blindsided us by losing their first 5 games. And now they're playing like Oregon we expected, and they've kicked it into gear. So that almost never happens. I can't even think of a good example. USC of 2016 would be the best one I can come up with. 1-3 to start the season. Sam Darnold kicks it in, and they get him on the field and they win 9 consecutive games and finish number 3 in the country, but they missed the playoffs because they lost 3 games. That's the best example I can go to off the top of my head. So fortunately, these teams are generally consistent. Yeah, there are ebbs and flows to the season, but most of the ebbs and flows to the season are from all the 6-4 and 4-6 teams out there. These teams, there's not a whole lot of ebb and flow. Yeah, Ohio State played a bad game against Nebraska. Yes, Georgia played a bad game against Kentucky, but they didn't lose. The one egregious loss on the board is, of course, Notre Dame losing at home to NIU. So we don't have to deal with that too much. But Adam is still giving more value to, well, the playoffs start in December. We're not playing them in September. We're playing them in December. So we want the 12 best teams in the country in December to be playing. And let's say South Carolina, they're 7-3 right now. Let's say they win their last 2 games, which they've got a scrimmage coming up this Saturday. Then they play Clemson, which would be another notch in their belt. And I do think at this point, without giving it much thought, that South Carolina is a better team than Clemson and should win that game, although they've got to go on the road. It's a noon game. So let's say they finish 9-3. Okay. A lot of you would state there should never be a 9-3 team in the playoff. Never. But you're fine with 10-2 teams. So why the dividing line that is so severe and so entrenched at 10-2 versus 9-3? Why is it there? Why isn't it between 9-3 and 8-4, or between 11-1 and 10-2? Oh, well, we wouldn't have enough teams to fill the spots. I had a couple of criticisms to a video I posted a few days ago, and the criticisms did not make any sense for the mere fact that based on the criticisms of teams that, quote, should not make the playoffs, we wouldn't have the number of teams to fill the spots. So we couldn't even fill the spots based on some people's standards. Falconer TRX, thank you so much for the super chat. I appreciate you. Falconer TRX is on board with us on the Miami show each and every Wednesday night. So you folks watching on the Miami channel, you know exactly what I'm talking about, but everybody should know this. Excellent Miami show. It's our longest running show here at the Voice of College Football. Longest running show, 402 episodes of Miami Live with myself and Cam Underwood from State of the U. He's the chief editor at the State of the U platform on SB Nation for Miami. Knows his stuff, fun guy, storyteller, great co-host. We have a great time. We've been doing it, again, for 400 plus episodes. Falconer TRX, always there for us. That's Wednesdays at 7 o'clock Eastern time. That should be a go-to for you. Even if you don't like Miami or could care less about Miami, try it out one time. Join us on Wednesdays at 7 p.m. Eastern time. Falconer says here, playoff system, you can win games on the schedule. Falconer spitting the truth here, coming in with this one. It's all about the U. And for Falconer TRX, it is all about the U. And lock of the week, Miami, Natty, Cam Heisman. Would that not be something? Cam Ward just needs to avoid those dry spells, those cold spots in his game when he goes 5 for 12 over the course of the 2 middle quarters that kind of hold him back. But thank you so much for the contributions, Falconer TRX. We've got the USC show coming up with Matt Zemek. It's over on the USC channel. That's at 10 Eastern and 7 Pacific. That is tonight. So looks like I get myself an hour off, and then we're back at it with USC Live, 10 Eastern, 7 Pacific, right here at the Voice of College Football. We have run through all the calls. We appreciate your calls. We will continue to break it down. I've got a conversation, so we got some really good stuff coming up here, folks. At 10 in the morning, we've got a video release with Steve Dace That's on the main channel. So be looking out for that. 10 a.m. Eastern time on Wednesday. Video release, Steve Dace and myself. We recorded with Bill Bender of Sporting News tomorrow. That's going to be out. We've got Zach Smith coming up on Thursday, in addition to all our other programming here at the Voice of College Football. So we are hitting it hard this week. We've got Indiana, Ohio State breakdowns as well. So check it all out. And we will see you next time on the USC show in 1 hour. College football is even more exciting with some action on the line. And the games are even better when you're cashing in. And the Voice of College Football is the place to be to get the greatest value. Let's start with my picks. 75% against the money line, 58% against the spread. I've got a 40-year track record. In fact, in 2023, at $100 played per game, you would have netted over $9,300. And guess what? I'm just the warm-up act. Steve Merrill, our ace in the hole, show stopper from Wager Talk. 6 years with the Voice of College Football, over 30 years in the industry. Steve gives us analysis on all the big games, but you can't miss Steve's weekly under-the-radar pick, which went 21-5 against the spread the last 2 seasons. I repeat, 21-5 against the spread. You also get picks from some of our top analysts here at the Voice of College Football, including Steve Dace and Matt Zemek. Become a YouTube channel member or Patreon member for just $99 per month. Go to the main channel on YouTube, click join, and select the betting tier. Do the same thing on Patreon. Make 2024 a winner now. College football is even more exciting with some action on the line. And the games are even better when you're cashing in. And the Voice of College Football is the place to be to get the greatest value. Let's start with my picks. 75% against the money line, 58% against the spread. I've got a 40-year track record. In fact, in 2023, at $100 played per game, you would have netted over $9,300. And guess what? I'm just the warm-up act. Steve Merrill, our ace in the hole, show stopper from Wager Talk. 6 years with the Voice of College Football, over 30 years in the industry. Steve gives us analysis on all the big games, but you can't miss Steve's weekly under-the-radar pick, which went 21-5 against the spread the last 2 seasons. I repeat, 21-5 against the spread. You also get picks from some of our top analysts here at the Voice of College Football, including Steve Dace and Matt Zemek. Become a YouTube channel member or Patreon member for just $99 per month. Go to the main channel on YouTube, click join, and select the betting tier. Do the same thing on Patreon. Make 2024 a winner now.